Hello class, this is lesson 1-9, multiplying and dividing decimals. This is the Learning Needed channel. My request to students in all videos, remember your reason to pass a GED exam and keep that reason close to your heart. Use it to motivate you to not give up and to continue to study, work on those practice problems, and get that help that you need to pass those GED exams. Second is don't give up. Keep going. You will pass the GED exam as long as you keep studying and working hard at it. You will get that certificate. Finally, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I can only produce this GED content with your continued support. Thank you so much in advance. If you are interested in one-on-one tutoring where I help you live with some practice problems, going over some material, coming up with a study plan, anything that you need to get that passing score on those GED exams, not just in math, but in all 4 of the subjects, I do have that service available in my website, which is in the video description below. Finally, the study material that I do suggest to students and that I have used with my students is the Kaplan GED Test Prep Book. It has very easy to understand lessons for all 4 GED exams. It is a pretty thick book, and they release a new version every year. You don't need to get the latest version. If you find a previous year at a cheaper price, that is totally fine. I find that it keeps the same material throughout most of the years with just a few updates, and you can use that as well. The calculator that you can bring with you to the GED exam is the TI-30XS model. No other calculator is allowed to be used, so it is a very good idea to become familiar with that calculator. Even if you don't have one physically, you will have a virtual one that you can use that works exactly the same as a real one, but having hands-on experience is something that I highly suggest. If you would like to get the latest copy of the book or the calculator, I have links to purchase those in my video description below. That way you know that you are getting the correct version. All right, let's get started. Multiplying decimals works the same way as multiplying whole numbers, but it does have an extra step. This extra step is to position the decimal point correctly in the answer. So you do have to keep track of where the decimal point goes in the answer. Unlike addition and subtraction of decimals, where you align the numbers by the decimal point and the answer is in the same position in terms of the decimal point, here you have to calculate it. The way that you know where the decimal goes in the answer is by making the following observation. The number of decimals in the answer is equal to the number of decimals in the numbers being multiplied. So what is a decimal place, or what is the number of decimal places? It's really just how many numbers are after the decimal point. So let's take a look at how to calculate those. Let's say that we are asked how many decimal places are in these 3 numbers, 0.42, 1.2, and 4.583. The number of decimal places, again, is how many numbers are after the decimal point. So for the first one, 0.42, there are 2 digits after the decimal point, so it has 2 decimal places. 1.2 has only the number 2 after the decimal point, so that is 1 decimal place. And 4.583 has 3 digits after the decimal point, so that is 3 decimal places, as shown here. Now that we know how to count decimal places in any number, here are the steps to multiply decimals. First, you're going to multiply the decimals as if they were whole numbers. So you're going to ignore or not look at the decimal place when multiplying, doing the actual multiplication of the numbers. Once you have that answer, you are going to count the number of decimal places in the numbers being multiplied, and you're going to add that number of decimal places to the answer. Now that was a lot of words, so let's look at an example. Let's say that we are asked to multiply 3.4 by 0.92. For step 1, we are going to act as if they are whole numbers, so it's going to look like 34 times 92. Because again, leading zeros or zeros in front don't add value to that digit. If I say the number 5, that's the same thing as if I say 0.5, and this 0 isn't helpful at all. So when you treat these as whole numbers, that 0 goes away, and it looks like 34 times 92. When you solve this by hand or by a calculator, you get 3,128. I'm not going to be going over do the hand calculation, that's in another video. This is a multiplication of decimals lesson, but you can do that hand calculation yourself if you would like for practice. Now we go to step number 2. We are going to count the number of decimal places in the numbers being multiplied. So this is 3.4 and 0.92. If we look at 3.4, it is only 1 digit after the decimal place, and 0.92 is 2 digits after the decimal place. So we have 1 decimal place and 2 decimal places respectively. we are going to add that amount of decimal places together, the sum of those, to the answer. So the answer is should have 3 decimal places. And the way that we get the answer to have 3 decimal places is to place the decimal point between 3 and 1. Because if we place it there, then that means that it has 1, 2, and 8 as decimal numbers, and that gives us the 3 decimal places. So the answer is 3.128. Another popular way that you may see counting number of decimal places is by counting how far away the decimal point is from the rightmost number. So for example, in 3.4, you could say that it is 1 decimal place away from the rightmost edge, and for 0.92, you can say that it is 2 decimal places away from the rightmost edge. It is another way that it can be shown how to count decimal places. I just find that counting the number of digits after the decimal place is easiest for me, but whatever works for you or however you see it taught in your reference materials. When you are dividing, it is the dividend divided by the divisor. Now, a requirement for dividing decimals is that if the divisor, or the second number in the division problem, is a decimal number, then you move the decimal point in both the divisor and the dividend. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to count the decimal places in the divisor and move that amount of decimal places in both the divisor and the dividend. And when you do this, you'll find that it may be required to add zeros to the dividend. So let's set up this problem. 4.6 divided by 1.25. If you look at the reference of the parts that make up the division problem, you'll see that 1.25 is the divisor. If you set it up by hand, then it looks like 4.6 divided by 1.25, where 1.25 is outside the little house or hut or whatever you may call it, and 4.6 is on the inside. So since the divisor has 2 decimal places, we are going to move the decimal places in both the divisor and the dividend, or in both numbers, 2 places to the right, and we will need to add 1 0. So if we look here at the problem we set up, we're going to take the decimal point in the divisor and move it 2 places to the right, so that it is here. And we're going to do the same thing in the dividend, so that it is over here. But if you move it in the second place here, you'll see that there's an empty spot, and this is where we will need to add in the 0. So after we move the decimal places, the problem will be set up like this. It will be 460 divided by 125. One thing to know about dividing decimals is that decimal division has no remainders. In the past, when you did hand calculation of divisions, if you had any numbers left over, you just said that it was a remainder of that amount. But here, we are going to instead continuously add zeros to the end of the decimal and continue solving. So let's solve now 4.6 divided by 1.25. And as a reminder, after we move the decimal places, it looks like 460 divided by 125. I added a decimal point at the end of 460 because any whole number actually has a decimal point at the end of it. Because if you add zeros to the end of any whole number, it's still the same value. So I have 5 here, and that's really the same as saying 5.0 or 5.000 and so on and so forth. So this is just to note where the decimal place is in a whole number. It is secretly at the end of the whole number. So now that I know where the decimal point is, I am going to place the decimal point in the quotient part of the answer, there up right after the 0, above the line. So when I solve the division problem, I'll know where the decimal point goes as I'm solving it. So now we solve as a regular division problem by hand, and I ask, how many times does 125 go into 460 without going over? And I'll tell you that 125 times 3 is 375, and that is the highest number that will not go over 460. So I set 3 in the quotient part of the answer, and then I subtract 375 from 460, and that gives us 85. Now here, again, in other division problems and non-decimal division problems, you would have a remainder of 85. But with decimal division, we're going to continuously add zeros to solve for the entire decimal. And so I add a 0 at the end of the dividend, and then I drop it down and continue solving. So instead of 85, it is now 850, and I once again ask, how many times does 125 go into 850 without going over? And using multiplication, I will tell you that it is 6. So we set 6 in the quotient part of the answer or above, and then we subtract 750 from 850, and that leaves us with 100. We still have a value that we are trying to solve for. So we add another 0 to the end of the dividend and then drop it down. So now we are trying to see how many times does 125 go into 1,000 without going over, and that number is 8. So we set 8 as in the quotient. We subtract 1,000 from 1,000 and we finally get 0. So with any division problem, once you get to 0, that means that you are done. And the answer here is 3.68. And we'll go over another problem in the example problems. Let's look at an example problem. A shop needs to fill a container of 1.8 gallons with gas. Gas is currently priced at $2.89 per gallon. How much will the gas cost? So this is simply a multiplication of two decimal numbers. So first, you are going to multiply these numbers as if they were whole numbers. So you ignore the decimal point and you are simply multiplying 289 by 18. When you solve that, you get an answer of 5,202. Next, you are going to count the number of decimal places in the numbers being multiplied. So you look at the number of decimal places in $2.89 and in 1.8 gallons. And 2.89 has 2 decimal places and 1.8 has 1 decimal place, and the sum of that is 3 decimal places. So you add 3 decimal places to the answer, which means that you are going to place the decimal point here so that the answer has 3 decimal places, and the answer goes from 5,202 to 5.202, and that is the answer. Example problem 2. A car drove 23.36 miles on 6.4 gallons of fuel. How many miles per gallon did the car get? So we set this up as a division problem where it looks like 23.36 divided by 6.4. So you'll see here that the divisor is 6.4 and it has 1 decimal place. Therefore, we move the divisor and dividend 1 decimal place to the right. So if we set it up here, we start with 23.36 divided by 6.4, and we move the decimal place in 6.4 1 to the right, and we'll move it 1 to the right here. And so it will look like this. 233.6 divided by 64. Unlike the division problem we did in the past where we had to add zeros, here the decimal place is still part of the dividend. So all we're going to do is when we set it up and start solving this division problem, we know where the decimal point goes. It goes between the 3 and the 6, and we simply align the decimal in the quotient and start solving. So I ask, as a regular division problem, how many times does 64 go into 2? The answer is 0. So I move on to the next 2 places. How many times does 64 go into 23? That answer is 0. So I add in the next place value, and the question becomes, how many times does 64 go into 233? And the answer is 3, because 64 times 3 is 192, and that is the highest number that you can multiply it by without going over. So we set 3 in the quotient to the left of the decimal because that's where it aligns, and then we subtract 192 from 233, and that gives us 41. We are still not done with the digits in the dividend, so next we're going to drop down to 6, and it really doesn't make a difference that it is after the decimal point. The decimal point here in the dividend just tells us where the decimal point goes in the answer or in the quotient. So we just drop down to 6 and solve with 416. And the question becomes, how many times does 64 go into 416? And the answer here is 6. So we set 6 in the quotient and we subtract 384 from 416, and that gives us 32. We are still not done with this decimal division problem because we still have an amount that we are trying to solve for. So instead of saying a remainder of 32, we add a 0 to the end of the dividend. We drop down that 0, and now we are solving against 320. So we ask, how many times does 64 go into 320 without going over? The answer there is 5. So we set 5 in the quotient. We subtract 320 from 320, and we get the 0. So the answer here is 3.65. And that was today's lesson of multiplying and dividing decimals. I would highly encourage you guys to watch the dividing decimal section a couple more times just to make sure that you get it, and leave me a comment. Let me know if the explanation was not helpful or if you have any other questions, and I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.